The Airacobra arrived in the winter of 1942, and the pilots who were supposed to fly it did not know what to make of it. The Bell P-39 had been designed in Buffalo, New York, by engineers who had made an unconventional decision. They had placed the engine behind the pilot rather than in front of him. The Allison V-1711 sat in the middle of the fuselage, behind the cockpit, driving the propeller through a long extension shaft that ran beneath the pilot's seat. The nose, freed from the engine, housed the armament, a 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, flanked by 2.50 caliber machine guns, with additional .30 caliber guns mounted in the wings. The arrangement gave the P-39 a distinctive silhouette and a distinctive reputation. The British had received it first. The Royal Air Force evaluated the Airacobra in 1941 and reached a verdict that became the aircraft's defining characterization in Western aviation history. It was mediocre at altitude, prone to spinning, and outclassed by the Messerschmitt Bf 109 in the kind of high-altitude combat that the RAF expected to fight. The British sent their Airacobras to the Soviet Union and replaced them with Spitfires. The transaction was conducted with the brisk efficiency of men offloading something they did not want onto someone who had fewer options. The Soviet pilots who received the first P-39s in late 1941 and early 1942 were not in a position to be selective. They were flying MiG-3s and Yak-1s against a Luftwaffe that had destroyed most of the Soviet Air Force on the ground in the first days of Operation Barbarossa. The planes that survived the initial catastrophe were being flown by pilots who were surviving on skill and desperation in roughly equal measure. Anything that flew and carried guns was welcome. Alexander Pokryshkin received his first Airacobra in January 1943, when his regiment, the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, was pulled back from the front lines to re-equip near the Iranian border. He had been flying since 1939. He had survived the disasters of 1941, the grinding attrition of 1942, and the specific education in what worked and what did not that only combat at the edge of survival provides. By January 1943, he had accumulated a body of knowledge about air combat that he kept in notebooks. Observations about German tactics, about the weaknesses of Soviet doctrine, about the gap between what the manuals said and what happened when you were actually in the air with a Bf 109 trying to kill you. He approached the Airacobra the way he approached everything, as a problem to be understood before it could be used. The car door was the first thing. The P-39 did not have a conventional sliding canopy. It had two car-style doors, one on each side of the cockpit, that the pilot opened to enter and exit the aircraft. It was an unusual feature, and Soviet pilots greeted it with the specific skepticism that aviators reserve for aircraft that do not behave like aircraft. A door that opened like an automobile was a door that could jam, that could be difficult to open under G-load, that could trap a pilot in a burning plane. Pokryshkin noted the concern and set it aside. He was more interested in the gun. The 37mm cannon, a weapon of a caliber that no other fighter in the Soviet inventory carried, fired through the propeller hub at a rate that made it, effectively, a single-shot weapon in the hands of a pilot who could not hold his aim. One round, correctly placed, would destroy a German bomber. Incorrectly placed, or fired at a target that was moving, maneuvering, doing what aircraft do when they are trying not to be shot, it was a weapon that required patience and positioning that most combat situations did not provide. Pokryshkin understood this as a tactical problem, not a limitation. He began to think about what kind of attack geometry would make the 37mm reliable. High deflection shots, the kind where the target was crossing your path at an angle, were wrong for this gun. The gun required a pursuit curve, a nearly dead astern approach, the target large and stable in the gun sight for the fraction of a second between trigger and impact. To get that geometry, you needed speed and altitude. You needed to come from above, fast, with the target already committed to a flight path it could not change in time. He wrote it down. The pilots of the 16th Guards spent 3 weeks with the Airacobra before they flew it in combat. 3 weeks was not much time to learn an aircraft. It was enough time to understand its character, the way it handled at low altitude, the way the engine responded, the specific feel of a machine whose weight distribution was unlike anything they had flown before. The mid-mounted engine placed the center of gravity differently than a conventional fighter. The P-39 was sensitive in ways that required attention, and it rewarded pilots who gave it that attention with performance that the RAF's assessment had not fully captured. The RAF had been wrong, not about the facts, but about the conclusions. The Airacobra was genuinely mediocre above 15,000 feet. The Allison engine, unsupercharged to the degree that altitude combat required, lost power as the air thinned. At 20,000 feet, it was outclassed by the Bf-109G and the FW-190 in every relevant category. The British assessment had been accurate for the war the RAF was fighting, a war of high-altitude interception over England and occupied Europe, where the Germans came in at altitudes that required climbing to meet them. The Eastern Front was a different war. The fighting over the Soviet Union in 1942 and 1943 happened at altitudes that Western pilots would have found startlingly low, between 3,000 and 12,000 feet, where the Allison engine performed well, where the P-39's handling was crisp and responsive, where its speed in a dive was competitive with anything the Luftwaffe could put in the air. The Germans were not conducting strategic bombing campaigns that required high-altitude escort. They were supporting ground operations, which meant their aircraft were working at the altitudes where the P-39 was at its best. Pokryshkin flew the Airacobra for the first time in early January 1943 and noticed something that the RAF evaluation had not emphasized. The visibility from the cockpit was exceptional. The mid-engine layout that made the aircraft unusual also made the nose short and low. A pilot sitting in a P-39 cockpit could see forward and downward at angles that a conventional fighter, with its engine blocking the view ahead, could not match. In combat, where finding the enemy before the enemy found you was often the decisive factor, visibility was not a secondary consideration. It was, Pokryshkin thought, one of the things the aircraft did correctly. He also noticed the dive. The P-39's weight, heavier than the Yak-1, heavier than the MiG-3, gave it a dive acceleration that surprised pilots accustomed to lighter Soviet fighters. Once pointed downward, the Airacobra built speed quickly and held it. A pilot who had altitude could convert that altitude into speed faster in a P-39 than in almost any other fighter available to the Soviet Air Force in early 1943. Pokryshkin had been thinking about altitude and speed since his first combat in 1941. He had watched pilots die because they had allowed themselves to be caught slow and low without the energy to maneuver or escape. He had watched German pilots exploit altitude advantages with a systematic efficiency that the Soviet Air Force, flying older aircraft with older tactics, had been unable to counter. The Airacobra was not a solution to this problem by itself, but it was, he was beginning to understand, a machine that could be made into a solution if the tactics were built around what it actually did, rather than what a conventional fighter was supposed to do. He modified his aircraft before the regiment returned to the front. The P-39's three weapon systems, the 37mm cannon, the 2.50 caliber nose guns, and the .30 caliber wing guns, were normally triggered separately, each on its own firing button. Pokryshkin connected all three to a single trigger. When he fired, everything fired simultaneously. The cannon, the heavy machine guns, the wing guns, the combined weight of the P-39's entire armament delivered in a single burst at whatever was in the gun sight. It was a simple modification. It spread through the Soviet units flying Airacobras within months. The regiment returned to the front in April 1943, assigned to the Kuban region in southern Russia, a strip of territory east of the Crimean Peninsula, where the Luftwaffe and the Soviet Air Force were about to fight the largest sustained air battle of the war. Pokryshkin had his notebooks. He had his modified aircraft. He had 3 weeks of observation about what the P-39 could do. He was about to find out if his conclusions were correct. The engineers at Bell Aircraft in Buffalo had not designed the P-39 for the Eastern Front. They had designed it for a set of requirements issued by the United States Army Air Corps in 1937, requirements that reflected what American planners expected future air combat to look like. The result was an aircraft that made sense on paper and proved problematic in practice, for reasons that had everything to do with the specific assumptions built into its design. The decision to mount the engine behind the pilot had been made for two reasons. The first was armament. Placing the engine amidships freed the nose for weapons, specifically for a large-caliber cannon firing through the propeller hub, a configuration that European designers had been pursuing and that American planners found compelling. A 37mm cannon in the nose of a fighter was, in theory, a weapon that could destroy any aircraft it hit with a single round. The theory was correct. The practical difficulty was hitting anything with a weapon that fired slowly and kicked hard in the specific chaos of a turning dogfight where the target was rarely where you expected it to be. The second reason was tricycle landing gear. The P-39 used a nose wheel configuration rather than the conventional tail wheel that most fighters of the era employed. A nose wheel aircraft sat level on the ground, with better forward visibility during taxi and takeoff, and was easier for inexperienced pilots to land without the ground-looping tendency that tailwheel aircraft required skill to manage. The mid-engine layout made the nose wheel configuration possible by keeping weight distribution manageable. Both decisions were rational. Together, they created an aircraft that was heavier than its contemporaries, that carried its weight in an unusual place, and that suffered for it above the altitudes where the Allison engine could breathe. What the engineers in Buffalo could not have known in 1937 was that the war their aircraft would fight, at least the largest and most sustained air campaign of the conflict, would be conducted at altitudes where none of this mattered. The Eastern Front's air war was a low-altitude war by the logic of its own objectives. German aircraft over the Soviet Union in 1942 and 1943 were primarily supporting ground operations, flying close air support for infantry, escorting Stuka dive bombers attacking Soviet armor and supply lines, interdicting Soviet communications within range of the front. These missions were conducted between 3,000 and 12,000 feet. The strategic bombing campaigns that had driven the RAF's requirement for high-altitude performance simply did not exist over the Eastern Front in the same form. At 10,000 feet, the Allison V1710 produced approximately 1,150 horsepower, enough to push the P-39 to speeds that were competitive with the Bf-109F and G at the same altitude. The handling at these altitudes was clean and responsive. The dive acceleration, product of the aircraft's weight and aerodynamic profile, was better than most fighters the Soviets were flying. The aircraft that the RAF had discarded as inadequate was, at the altitudes where the Eastern Front's air war was actually fought, a capable and competitive fighter. Pokryshkin had understood this during his 3 weeks with the aircraft near the Iranian border. He had taken the P-39 to the altitudes where he expected to fight and found an aircraft that rewarded the pilot who worked with its characteristics rather than against them. The 37mm cannon was the center of this understanding. At low altitude, in the pursuit geometry that Pokryshkin had been designing his tactics around, coming from above, fast, the target committed to a flight path, the cannon was not a liability. It was the most destructive single weapon carried by any fighter on the Eastern Front. Ju-87 Stuka caught in that geometry, with the P-39 closing from above and behind, did not require a burst. It required one round, placed correctly, and it was finished. The question was how to arrive at that geometry reliably. The answer was altitude and speed. Specifically, altitude and speed acquired before the engagement began, so that the pilot entered the fight with the energy already in the aircraft rather than trying to build it under fire. He wrote this down too. The notebooks were getting thick. The Soviet Air Force in 1941 had a doctrine, and the doctrine was wrong. It had been built around assumptions that the Spanish Civil War and the Winter War against Finland had seemed to confirm. Assumptions about formation flying, about the primacy of the group over the individual, about engagement ranges and attack profiles that reflected the aircraft and the enemies of the late 1930s. When Germany invaded in June 1941 and the Luftwaffe met Soviet fighters in combat, the doctrine collapsed almost immediately. The Germans flew in pairs and fours, loose, flexible formations that allowed individual pilots to maneuver freely while maintaining mutual support. The Soviets flew in tight threes, which looked disciplined on paper and made independent maneuvering nearly impossible in practice. Pokryshkin had understood this within the first weeks of the war. He had written about it. He had argued about it with his superiors. In the Soviet Union in 1942, arguing with your superiors about doctrine was not a career-advancing activity. It was an activity that could end your career, your freedom, or your life, depending on how the argument went and who was listening. Pokryshkin had been grounded, investigated, threatened with court-martial. He had survived because he had supporters in positions that mattered, and because the results he produced in the air were difficult to argue with, even for men committed to the doctrine he was criticizing. By January 1943, when his regiment converted to the Airacobra, he had been thinking about the problem for 18 months. The P-39 clarified the thinking. The aircraft's characteristics, its dive speed, its low-altitude performance, the destructive single-shot potential of the 37mm cannon, pointed toward a specific style of combat. Not the turning dogfight that dominated popular imagination of aerial warfare, where two fighters circled each other in tightening spirals until one got behind the other. That style of combat wasted what the P-39 did well and exposed what it did poorly. The Airacobra was not the most agile fighter at low speed. It did not turn as tightly as a Bf 109 at the speeds where extended maneuvering occurred. It did not need to. Pokryshkin's formula, altitude, speed, maneuver, fire, was not four equal elements. It was a sequence. Altitude came first because altitude was stored energy. A pilot with altitude could choose when and how to convert that energy into speed. Speed came second because speed was what made the attack possible, the closing velocity that gave the enemy no time to react, that made the geometry of the cannon shot achievable before the target moved out of it. Maneuver was third and brief, the final adjustment that placed the gun sight on the target. Fire was last and fast, the 37mm round delivered at the moment of maximum advantage. The formula described an attack that lasted seconds and was over before the enemy fully understood it was happening. This was not how Soviet fighter pilots had been trained to fight. Soviet doctrine emphasized sustained engagements, formation integrity, the coordination of the group. Pokryshkin's approach emphasized individual energy management, the preparation of the attack before the attack began, and the exploitation of a single moment of advantage rather than the grinding attrition of a prolonged turning fight. He taught it in the evenings, in the dugout that his regiment mates called the Design Bureau. The walls were covered in diagrams, sheets of paper with attack geometries, altitude profiles, the mathematics of closing speed and deflection angles. Pokryshkin held a model aircraft in his hands and walked his pilots through the sequences: where to be before the fight, how to enter, where to aim, when to fire, how to exit if the first pass did not succeed. The pilots who sat in that dugout and watched him trace attack profiles on a diagram were flying the same aircraft he was flying. They had the same 37mm cannon, the same dive acceleration, the same low-altitude performance envelope. What they were getting from the diagrams was the understanding of how to make the aircraft's characteristics into a system. Not a collection of specifications, but a method. The Kuban was waiting. In April 1943, the largest air battle of the war was about to begin, and Pokryshkin's regiment was about to find out whether what had been worked out on paper in a dugout with model aircraft on the walls would work in the sky above a river delta with the Luftwaffe's best units flying against them. The Kuban was a flat country, river delta and farmland stretching east from the Crimean Peninsula toward the Caucasus, wide sky above it, very little terrain to hide in or use for tactical advantage. In the spring of 1943, it was also one of the most contested pieces of airspace on Earth. The Germans held the Kuban bridgehead, a strip of territory on the eastern shore of the Kerch Strait, as the last remnant of their 1942 advance into the Caucasus. Holding it required air superiority over the approaches, which meant that the Luftwaffe units based in Crimea were flying constant combat air patrols across the strait. The Soviet Air Force, assigned to break that superiority and support the ground offensive that would eventually clear the bridgehead, was flying against them with everything it had. Both sides were sending their best. The Germans had JG-52 and JG-3 Udet, Jagdgeschwader with pilots who had been flying since 1939 and 1940, men with scores that would have made them legends in any other air force, and who in the Luftwaffe were simply the senior members of units that produced aces the way factories produced parts. The Soviet side had the Guards regiments, the units that had survived the disasters of 1941 and 1942 and been rebuilt around the pilots who had learned from those disasters. Pokryshkin's regiment arrived in the Kuban in early April 1943. The 4th Air Army, to which the regiment was assigned, had something that most Soviet air units had not previously operated with: mobile ground-based radar. The stations had been arriving since the summer of 1942, and the 4th Air Army had been developing procedures for using them, not merely as early warning systems, but as active tools for directing intercepts, positioning fighters before the engagement began, giving pilots information about the enemy's altitude and heading while the enemy was still minutes away. Pokryshkin understood immediately what this meant for his formula: altitude, speed, maneuver, fire. The sequence depended on the pilot having altitude before the fight began. Acquiring altitude after spotting the enemy was often too late. The enemy was already there, already at his own altitude, already in a position to dictate the terms of the engagement. But if the radar gave you the enemy's position while he was still 10 minutes out, his altitude, his heading, his approximate strength, you could be above him when he arrived. You could enter the fight with the energy already in the aircraft, already converted from the altitude the radar had given you time to reach. The radar transformed the formula from a tactical principle into a practical system. Pokryshkin worked with the ground controllers directly, establishing communication procedures that went beyond what the standard protocols required. He wanted to know altitude first, always altitude first, because everything else derived from that. He wanted continuous updates as the enemy formation approached, so he could adjust his own position as the geometry evolved. He wanted the controllers to understand that the information they were passing up was not background context, but the foundation of the attack he was building in the air above them. The controllers learned his requirements, the communication improved. His regiment developed a patrol pattern they called the pendulum. Flights of Airacobras sweeping back and forth across the approaches to the bridgehead at altitudes that the radar picture told them were correct, positioned to intercept before the German formations reached their targets. The pattern was not elegant. It was exhausting for the pilots, who flew multiple sorties per day in an aircraft that had no autopilot and required continuous attention. But it worked in the specific sense that mattered. It placed Soviet fighters above German aircraft at the moment of contact, consistently and repeatedly, rather than in the occasional lucky encounter that had characterized earlier operations. The Luftwaffe noticed. Not immediately. The first engagements of the Kuban campaign in April 1943 were chaotic in the way that all large air battles are chaotic, with hundreds of aircraft in the sky simultaneously and no single pilot able to see more than a fraction of what was happening. But the pattern emerged over days and weeks. The Soviet fighters were appearing from above, attacking fast, and disengaging before the Germans could bring their own advantages to bear. Pokryshkin was in the air for most of it. On April 29, 1943, the radar picked up a large German formation approaching from the Crimean side. The controllers counted the contacts and passed the information up. 3 squadrons of Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, escorted by Bf-109 fighters. The formation was flying at medium altitude, headed toward Soviet positions on the eastern shore of the strait. It was a standard interdiction mission, the kind the Luftwaffe had been flying since the campaign began, with the Stukas carrying the bombs and the 109s keeping Soviet fighters away from them. Pokryshkin had 8 P-39s. 8 against 3 squadrons was not a favorable ratio by any conventional calculation. A Stuka squadron carried 9 to 12 aircraft. 3 squadrons meant somewhere between 27 and 36 bombers, plus the fighter escort, possibly another dozen or more Bf 109s. The German formation outnumbered the Soviet intercept force by a factor of 5 or 6 to 1. The ratio was not the point. The radar had given Pokryshkin time. His 8 Airacobras were above the German formation when it arrived, not scrambling to catch up, not climbing through the bombers' altitude with their speed bled off from the climb, but already there, already fast, already in the geometry that the formula required. The Stukas were below him, committed to their attack heading, the slow, heavy bombers doing what slow, heavy bombers do when they are trying to reach a target, flying straight and level to give their bombardiers a stable platform. Straight and level was precisely the attack geometry that the 37mm cannon required. Pokryshkin led the first pass himself. The Airacobra came down fast from above and behind, the Stuka growing in the gun sight at a rate that left no time for the German rear gunner to track and engage effectively. He fired once. The 37mm round, a projectile that weighed nearly a pound and was traveling at over 2,000 feet per second, struck the Stuka and the Stuka came apart. He was already pulling up and away before the pieces reached the ground. His pilots followed the same geometry, each one taking the approach that the altitude and speed had made possible, each one firing the combined armament that Pokryshkin's modification had connected to a single trigger. The German escort, arriving late to a fight that had already been decided by positioning, found themselves reacting rather than acting, chasing Airacobras that were already climbing back to altitude, already resetting for the next pass. When the engagement ended, 12 German aircraft had been destroyed. Pokryshkin had shot down 5 of them. Not one Soviet aircraft had been lost. The action was reported up the chain of command and eventually reached the Soviet Air Force headquarters, where it was read alongside the growing body of documentation that Pokryshkin's regiment had been generating since the Kuban campaign began. The tactics were analyzed. The results were assessed. In June 1943, Pokryshkin's formula, altitude, speed, maneuver, fire, was formally distributed to all Soviet air armies as recommended doctrine. The man who had been threatened with court-martial for criticizing Soviet aerial tactics in 1942 had written the replacement. The Luftwaffe responded to what was happening over the Kuban with the only tool available to a fighter force that finds itself tactically outmaneuvered: individual excellence. JG-52's senior pilots, men with scores in the dozens, some approaching 100 confirmed kills, flew against Pokryshkin's regiment personally, looking for the engagement that would break the pattern. Some of them found it. The Kuban was not a campaign without Soviet losses, and Pokryshkin was not invulnerable. But the German ground controllers had begun broadcasting a warning whenever his aircraft appeared. Achtung! Pokryshkin in the air. Junior Luftwaffe pilots were instructed to disengage immediately. Senior pilots were advised to exercise extreme caution. The warning was, in its way, the most precise assessment of what Pokryshkin had built. Not a description of his personal skill, though his personal skill was exceptional, but a recognition that the man and the machine and the tactics had become something that the Luftwaffe's standard responses could not reliably handle. The P-39 that the RAF had discarded was in the air over the Kuban, and the Germans were telling their pilots to run from it. The Soviet Union awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times to Alexander Pokryshkin. The first award came in May 1943, after the opening weeks of the Kuban campaign. The second came in August 1943, 3 months later, after the campaign had concluded and the German bridgehead had been reduced and the results had been counted. The third came in August 1944, by which point Pokryshkin was commanding a division rather than flying a regiment, and his personal score had essentially stopped growing. Not because he had stopped flying, but because the Soviet High Command had decided, with the particular logic of a state that converts individuals into symbols, that losing him in combat was a risk the propaganda value of his continued existence did not justify. He was the first person in the Soviet armed forces to receive the Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times. The decoration was not what he cared about. What he cared about was that the tactics worked, and that the pilots he had trained were alive to confirm it. By the end of the Kuban campaign, Pokryshkin's regiment had one of the lowest loss rates of any Soviet fighter unit that had seen comparable combat. This was not luck. The Kuban was not a campaign where luck was a sufficient explanation for survival. It was the product of the specific preparation that Pokryshkin had imposed. The training, the formula, the communication procedures with the radar controllers, the insistence that his pilots understand the P-39's characteristics well enough to use them rather than fight against them. He had told them, in the dugout with the diagrams on the walls, that the chief thing in a fighter pilot's training was confidence in victory. The confidence he meant was not bravado. It was the specific confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you are going to do before you do it, from having rehearsed the geometry of the attack until it was not a decision made under fire, but a sequence executed from memory. The P-39 had made this possible in a specific way. A pilot who had internalized Pokryshkin's formula needed, above all else, an aircraft that could deliver altitude and speed reliably, that could climb to the position the radar picture required, and then dive with the acceleration the attack demanded. The Airacobra did both. Its climb rate was not exceptional by the standards of the best fighters of 1943, but it was adequate for the altitudes the Eastern Front required. Its dive acceleration, product of its weight and its aerodynamic profile, was better than adequate. Once a pilot was pointed downward in a P-39, the speed came quickly, and it stayed. The 37mm cannon remained the weapon that defined the aircraft's tactical identity. Pokryshkin had fired it enough by the summer of 1943 to understand its characteristics precisely. The round was slow by the standards of rifle-caliber weapons. Its muzzle velocity was lower than the .50 caliber machine guns mounted alongside it, which meant that at longer ranges the pilot had to lead the target more than he would with a faster round. At short range, in the pursuit geometry that the formula prescribed, this ceased to matter. The target was large in the gun sight, the closing speed was high, and the round reached it before the deflection calculation became critical. He had also learned what the cannon could do to an aircraft that it hit. A .50 caliber round damaged, a 37mm round destroyed. The distinction was not merely quantitative. It was the difference between an aircraft that might limp back to its airfield and an aircraft that ceased to exist as a coherent structure in the moment of impact. Against bombers, the effect was decisive. Against fighters, it required the positioning that made a shot possible. But when the shot was there, it was final. The modification he had made, connecting all 3 weapon systems to a single trigger, had been adopted across the Soviet units flying Airacobras because the pilots who tried it found it obvious in retrospect. The moment of the attack was brief. The pilot had one opportunity, possibly 2, to fire before the geometry changed and the target was gone. Having to choose between weapons in that moment was a demand the situation did not permit. Having everything fire at once was not an idea that required explanation once you had been in the situation it addressed. The Kuban had been the laboratory. The formula had passed its test. In February 1944, Pokryshkin was offered a promotion and a desk. The offer came from the Soviet Air Force Command and was framed as an honor, a senior training position, managing the development of new pilots, applying the expertise he had accumulated to the next generation of Soviet aviators. It was also, unmistakably, a removal from combat. The man whose call sign had become a warning in the Luftwaffe's radio net would be grounded, safely behind the lines, turning his methods into manuals. He refused immediately. The refusal was consistent with everything he had done since 1941. The notebooks, the arguments with superiors, the court-martial threat, the insistence on flying when the command wanted him to stop. Pokryshkin's relationship with Soviet military authority was the relationship of a man who understood the system well enough to work within it and cared about results enough to push against it when the system's requirements conflicted with what the war actually needed. He stayed with his regiment and his aircraft. By 1944, the P-39 he was flying was the N model, the P-39N, which had arrived in Soviet service in larger numbers than any previous variant. The United States had shipped 4,952 Airacobras to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease by the end of the war, out of a total production run of 9,584. More than half of every P-39 built ended up in Soviet hands. The aircraft that the RAF had rejected, and the USAAF had largely reassigned to secondary roles, had found in the Soviet Air Force the operational context that made it effective. The N model was incrementally better than the aircraft Pokryshkin had received in January 1943. The engine had been refined. The armament remained the same. The 37mm cannon, the .50 calibers, the wing guns that his modification had connected to a single trigger. The fundamental character of the aircraft was unchanged. Low-altitude performer, strong diver, sensitive handler that rewarded pilots who understood it and punished those who did not. Pokryshkin had been flying it for over a year by the time the third Hero of the Soviet Union award came in August 1944. He knew the aircraft the way a craftsman knows a tool used daily for years, not from the specification sheet, but from 10,000 hours of accumulated sensation, the specific feel of the controls at different speeds and altitudes, the way the engine sounded when it was working correctly, and the subtly different sound when something required attention. He had also, by 1944, largely stopped scoring victories. Not because the opportunities were absent. The air war on the Eastern Front continued until the final days of the conflict, and Pokryshkin flew until May 1945, when his last combat mission took him over Prague on the day of Germany's surrender. But the command had made its position clear. His value as a living symbol exceeded his value as an additional entry in the kill ledger. He was permitted to fly. He was not permitted to take the risks that adding to his score required. He complied, with the controlled frustration of a man who had spent 4 years developing the ability to do something and was now being asked to do it at reduced intensity. His pilots continued what he had built. The formula spread beyond his regiment, beyond the 9th Guards Air Division he commanded from June 1944, into the broader Soviet fighter force. Pilots who had never sat in the dugout with the diagrams on the walls were flying versions of the tactics that Pokryshkin had worked out on paper near the Iranian border in January 1943 and tested over the Kuban in April. The formula had been formalized into doctrine, translated into training materials, distributed to units that were flying Yaks and Lavochkins, as well as Airacobras, because the underlying logic was not specific to the P-39. It was specific to the problem of air combat at low altitude against a skilled and experienced opponent, and that problem did not change with the aircraft type. The P-39 had been the laboratory in which the solution was found. The solution outlasted the laboratory. The question the Airacobra's story poses is not why a rejected American fighter became the mount of the Soviet Union's greatest ace. The answer to that question is straightforward. The Eastern Front's air war happened at altitudes where the P-39 was competitive, and Alexander Pokryshkin was a man who built his tactics around what his aircraft actually did, rather than what doctrine said it should do. The combination produced results. The results speak for themselves in the kill ledger, and in the warning that German ground controllers broadcast whenever his aircraft appeared over the front lines. The more interesting question is what the story reveals about the relationship between a weapon and the person using it. The P-39 arrived in Soviet service with a reputation. The RAF's verdict, passed along through the informal channels by which pilots share assessments of equipment they have flown or heard about. The reputation was not false. The aircraft was genuinely limited above 15,000 feet. It was genuinely prone to spinning in the hands of pilots who did not understand its weight distribution. The British pilots who had evaluated it and found it wanting had been correct about what they observed. What they had not asked was whether different conditions might produce different conclusions. Pokryshkin asked that question. He asked it systematically, in the notebooks he kept and the diagrams he drew, and the training sessions he ran in the dugout that his regiment mates called the Design Bureau. He asked it with the specific rigor of a man who had watched pilots die in 1941 from the consequences of not asking it, from flying aircraft in ways that the aircraft could not support, from applying tactics to situations the tactics had not been designed for, from the accumulated institutional inertia of a doctrine that had stopped interrogating its own assumptions. The answer he found was that the P-39, at the altitudes and in the tactical framework the Eastern Front required, was not a mediocre fighter. It was a weapon waiting for the correct method of employment. The 37mm cannon, the feature that most complicated the P-39's use in conventional dogfighting, became, in Pokryshkin's hands and under his formula, the most destructive single weapon carried by any fighter on the Eastern Front. Not because the cannon changed, because the tactics changed to make the cannon's requirements achievable, rather than treating its requirements as limitations. This inversion, taking what looked like a weakness and finding the conditions under which it became a strength, was not unique to Pokryshkin. Military history offers other examples of weapons that were misread in one context and decisive in another. But the Airacobra story is a particularly clean example because the contrast is so sharp. The same aircraft, evaluated by professionals in Britain in 1941 and found inadequate, evaluated by a professional in the Soviet Union in 1943 and found to be the instrument of 48 confirmed aerial victories. The aircraft did not change. The question being asked of it changed. Bell's engineers in Buffalo had built a machine with specific characteristics: a mid-mounted engine, a large caliber nose cannon, strong low-altitude performance, excellent cockpit visibility, aggressive dive acceleration. Each characteristic was a fact about the aircraft. What those facts meant depended entirely on the context in which they were applied and the intelligence of the person doing the applying. Pokryshkin applied them in a context that matched their strengths and with an intelligence that extracted everything the aircraft had to give. The RAF had asked, "Is this aircraft good enough for the war we are fighting?" Pokryshkin had asked, "What war does this aircraft fight well, and how do I fight that war?" The second question was harder. It required setting aside the assumption that the aircraft should conform to existing doctrine and asking instead what doctrine the aircraft's characteristics implied. It required the kind of intellectual honesty that is difficult in any organization and was specifically dangerous in the Soviet Union of 1942, where the wrong answer to the wrong superior could end a career or a life. Pokryshkin asked it anyway. The Kuban was the answer. Alexander Pokryshkin flew his last combat mission on May 9, 1945, over Prague. It was the final day of the war in Europe. Germany had surrendered the previous day, but fighting continued in Czechoslovakia as German units attempted to break through to the American lines rather than surrender to the Soviets. Pokryshkin flew cover for the ground forces moving on the city. There were no aerial engagements. The Luftwaffe that had broadcast his name as a warning over the Kuban 2 years earlier no longer existed as a functioning force. He landed, climbed out of the cockpit, and the war was over. His final score was 59 confirmed aerial victories, 48 of them in the P-39 Airacobra. He had flown 650 combat sorties and fought 156 aerial engagements. He was, by the official count, the second highest scoring Soviet ace of the war, behind Ivan Kozhedub. He was, by any measure, the highest scoring pilot in history to have achieved the great majority of his victories in an American aircraft. The P-39 he had flown to the end. His regiment had converted to Lavochkin La-7 fighters in 1945, but Pokryshkin kept his Airacobra and flew it alongside the new aircraft, was the same basic machine that the RAF had rejected 4 years earlier. The car doors, the mid-mounted engine, the 37mm cannon in the nose, none of it had changed. What had changed was the understanding of what the machine was for. After the war, Pokryshkin wrote several books about his experiences. None of them were translated into English during his lifetime. He described the P-39 with the affection of a man describing a tool that had served him exactly as he had needed it to serve him, not because it was the finest instrument available, but because he had understood it completely and used it accordingly. He became Marshal of Aviation in 1972. He died in 1985. The Airacobra outlasted him in Soviet service. When the war ended in 1945, there were still 1,178 P-39s operational in the Soviet Air Force, the largest concentration of the type anywhere in the world. The aircraft that had been surplus to British requirements and marginal in American service had become, in the context where it was correctly understood, one of the defining fighters of the largest air war in history. The engineers in Buffalo had built something that worked. They had not known exactly where it would work, or who would figure out how to make it work there. That part required a pilot in a dugout near the Iranian border in January 1943, sitting with notebooks and diagrams and a model aircraft in his hands, asking the question that produced the answer. The question was simple: what does this aircraft do well? Everything else followed from the honesty of the answer. The tactics, the formula, the training, the warning that German controllers broadcast across the Kuban whenever the P-39 with the number 100 on its fuselage appeared on their radar screens. Achtung! Pokryshkin in the air! It was, in the end, a tribute not only to the pilot, but to the process, to the specific discipline of understanding a tool before using it, of building a method around what a weapon actually was, rather than what doctrine assumed it should be. Other pilots flew the Airacobra. Only Pokryshkin flew it like that. The difference between the two was not the aircraft. It was the question he had asked about it in the winter of 1942, and the rigor with which he had followed the answer wherever it led.